Welcome to Workplace Culture Store. This is the fifth and final in a series of videos that'll give you a glimpse into our philosophies and research. I am your host and creative director of Workplace Culture Store, Michelle Rochon-Wood. Welcome. Now that you've seen the 15 types of play and reminisced about your childhood, let me introduce you to a concept you might have heard once or twice before: intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is motivation you experience naturally while doing a task. Because you enjoy what you're doing, your motivation is intrinsic. You need no reason to do that task other than it feels rewarding. Extrinsic motivation is motivation you experience after completing a task. In other words, the outcome of that task is what motivates you to get it done. For all people, some of their work has intrinsic motivation. That work is work that doesn't feel like work, also known as our preferred types of play. If you're fortunate enough to do paid work for which you are intrinsically motivated, work that reminds you of the fun things you played as a kid, you are an intrinsically motivated employee. Notwithstanding the stuff that goes on in the workplaces that makes that harder, you'll probably be okay. For many people, some of their work requires extrinsic motivation. They do it because doing it allows them to keep their jobs, see the fruits of their more inspiring labors, or produces other results that make up for the tedium. In our daily lives, most of us have a mix of both. If you're lucky, intrinsic will outweigh extrinsic. If you remember the testimony I shared about my early career, you'll recall that I somehow knew I would derive very little satisfaction from tasks that didn't allow me to be artistic or at least creative. I didn't know much back then, but I did know that the only thing for which I had intrinsic motivation was storytelling and art. I knew that no extrinsic motivator would ever compensate for not being able to follow my passions. It's a little surprise that I discovered this was true of everyone. It has to do with what we played when we were kids. In my case, it was those blank pages I stapled together when I wanted to write my life story. If I still had those pages, I would fill them with the stuff you are learning about now. Arguably, that's what you're experiencing, a glimpse into how I made it possible to pursue my passion and make a living too. It turned out that storytelling and art have almost infinite possibilities in the working world, and I found out ways to incorporate those in my work. Observing all those people, young and old, hearing their work play testimonies helped me discover something universal about play. Each type provides survival advantages of their own, but play itself is also a means of survival, and in more ways than simply just the obvious physical advantages enjoyed by our ancestors, like hunting, building shelters, or finding food sources. Play is also, one, a processor of painful emotions, and two, a path to finding meaning in our lives. We find in play the things we most love about being alive, what connects us to our friends and communities, how we create beauty and culture and record our history, and how we find freedom and identity. We derive satisfaction from our careers based on what authentically engaged and excited us as kids, what we played when everything was still new. We shape our recreational and family lives around it. The fact that adults do too little of it might provide a clue to the dismal state of employee engagement and mental health in general. We're approaching it from the wrong angle. We've long believed that to play as adults, we must first conduct a kind of transaction with the universe, come to an agreement, as it were. In this transaction, through exhausting, painful work, we earn the privilege of playing. The more exhausting and painful the work, the better, because that means we really earned it. If my findings are correct, then play represents the prep work we did as kids to later work as adults. It happened in that order for a reason, because play nourishes and prepares the brain. It shapes it, maps it, inscribes it, and then feeds it with useful tools and chemicals that make work possible. In other words, if in our values system we put work before play, we're depriving our brains of that nourishment and then expecting our brains to perform on an empty tank. If we are to supply our minds with purpose, joy, and inspiration, we need to play. If work is part of that existence, if we learn to approach that work with playfulness by virtue of the momentum and the enthusiasm generated, it'll get done faster and with greater passion and intensity. It's not about playing until we feel like working. It's about playing because this is what gives our lives meaning. It's what drives us to work. Play processes the pain of loss, disappointment, failure, such that we are restored when we return to that work. We also approach that work with that needed playfulness, keeping a constant stream of energy flowing. It may not involve an enormous change in the hours you keep. It might merely be a shift in focus, an awareness of what play gives you as a member of a playing species. This introduction has shown you the basics of what my research uncovered. Tune in again. We will look at all these concepts in greater detail and examine some really fascinating stories from the working world. Thank you, and see you next time.